When Fear is Not Afraid, the fourth Velvet Paw of Asquith novel, and the first in the Morrigan trilogy, by Thomas Caulfield. Read by the author. Chapter 3. The great library of Liebe is huge and old, and has the sort of prestige that envy was originally invented for. Lydia loved working in it, provided she didn't interact with those frequenting the place. Questions regarding books on interpretive paw painting, or the nomenclature of seahorses, she could manage by pointing. But anything more detailed had dire consequences. And although being curt and pointing reduced the chances of violence, it also left her dreadfully lonely. She sat behind the borrowing desk and tried not to assault anyone, which she achieved by sitting on her paws and forcing the sort of smile that looked as though it involved sutures. Because punching patrons in the face wasn't condoned by the library board, she tried negotiating a clause in her contract which ignored assaults that didn't require hospitalization. When her boss had laughed at this, she punched him in the face, which left her on ice so thin that it might be better described as a meniscus. As a result, pointing was the only way she could ensure patrons weren't assaulted. It was, however, frustrating that despite years of therapy, it was a technique she'd developed herself. Despite this, opportunities for assault had lessened since the library began trialling new signage to indicate exactly where the non-fiction was. Lydia looked at one of them, which was shiny and well lit, with large letters and an arrow, and was relieved at the number of patrons taking its advice rather than asking for hers. This was fortunate, because Lydia found the phrase non-fiction as irritating as their requests for directions to it. Non-fiction suggests fiction is in some way superior, which was ridiculous, she thought, considering it's founded on the intangible. As a consequence, she felt non-fiction ought to be labelled independently. Factual, for example, which would help rectify the inequality of invention over reality in much the same way she battled insanity. Were patrons to ask her where the factual books resided, she was convinced she'd be less inclined to punch them in the face. When she'd mentioned this to her boss, Fingleberry had laughed again, but not before cowering behind a barricade of books he'd piled upon his desk. She sat on her paws and tried appearing sane. To be behind the borrowing desk was unusual, as her temper had her generally assigned to reshelving, which suited her because it allowed opportunity to read. This morning, however, a staff member was away and the library was busy. Fingleberry had initially assigned her to the help desk before realising the hypocrisy of such appointment. She was subsequently assigned to the borrowing desk, which, although just as dangerous, was less likely to have patrons ask where the non-fiction was. She removed her paws and shook them, dreading the thought of using the borrowing stamp in case she used it on patrons' faces. She had to show restraint. She owed it to herself, and to Funnel Bremley, and Fingleberry for that matter, let alone innocent members of the public. She sat on her paws again, wondering if she could get patrons to stamp their own books by using facial gestures only. If not, she'd try one of Funnel Bremley's ridiculous coping mechanisms while reaching for it. After all, polite dinner conversation was preferable to extreme violence unless extreme violence was its subject matter. When a young dog approached, she groaned and sat harder. He smiled and waved a book helpfully. "I wish to borrow this, please," he said, handing over a book about the nomenclature of seahorses. After some facial gestures that didn't help either of them, Lydia removed her paws, took the book and waited for his library card. But so excited was he about seahorse nomenclature that he forgot about it. "Card," she said, extending a paw. Realising the oversight, he apologised and rummaged through his fur. "Sorry," he said, handing it over. "I forgot about that bit. I'm just so excited to find a book on seahorses, you see, especially their nomenclature." She took a deep breath and inserted a subject extrapolative coping mechanism. "Do you like seahorses?" she asked, realising she wanted to punch herself in the face. Oh, yes, indeed. They are the most fascinating creatures imaginable. I have read over 7 books on them, but have never come across this one before. I only read books on seahorses, you see, because they interest me considerably. Do you mean 8 or 300? She asked, already bored. What? Do you mean you have read 8 books on seahorses or 300? The dog blinked, not understanding. I don't understand, he said. You said that you've read over 7 books, which implies a number greater than 7. So you do mean 8, with this being your 9th, or a figure nearer 300? Well, 300 is an awful lot of books. I don't think anyone's ever read 300 books on anything. I have. But on seahorses? No. Well, that's good. He laughed. Otherwise I'd have to ask you where you found them all. And I wouldn't tell you. You wouldn't? Why not? Because I'm not the one interpreting the world through a narrow-minded assumption that reading only what interests me affords a realistic view of it, a view which happens to justify avoiding the convoluted, intricate confusion it's built from, which would not only prove the ignorance of said assumption, but disprove the assumption that I'm not at all ignorant. After some more blinks, the dog said, I'm sorry, but I didn't understand a word of that. I'm not surprised. Perhaps you could explain it again. You're an idiot. She stamped card and book harder than necessary, while the dog looked on in confusion. Are you being sarcastic? He asked, with a knowing smile. That you even asked proves my point. Wait, are you saying I'm stupid? I don't think I need to now. She handed both back to him. Do you like seahorses? He asked, taking them. I've never tried them. No, I mean, does the subject interest you? Not particularly. Well, perhaps I can convince you otherwise. Perhaps over dinner? Perhaps not. Well, we don't have to talk about seahorses, of course. We could talk about other things. Like what? He shrugged. I don't know. He glanced at some books nearby. 18th century architectural heritage of Splam? I can borrow a book on that. Ah, but you can't talk to a book. It would be far more interesting than talking to you. Well, that's not very nice. Neither are seahorses. He stared, realizing she wasn't joking. I think you're just being rude. Oh, so you're not stupid. Why are you being so insulting? Why are you so stupid? He glared. You're really mean, you know. You have no idea, she said, before punching him in the face. 20 minutes later, after the ambulance had left and the borrowing desk hosed down, Fingleberry asked her to step into his office for some very stern words, most of which would be his. Unlike the library, Fingleberry Flamp's Yogurt's office was small and cramped, with barely room for a desk. Despite being head librarian, this wasn't surprising. Designed from the outset to be the greatest library in the world, the Great Library of Liebe housed books at the expense of everything else, including administration. Indeed, Fingleberry had been surprised he'd been given an office at all, having expected a cardboard box, or one of the wooden packing crates the library's books arrived in. Other library staff were not so fortunate, although they did have places to retreat when necessary. There was the pavement, for example, outside. Despite its lack of size, Fingleberry's office was lined with shelving and packed with so many books that the removal of one would remove them all. The books were Fingleberry's favourites, known volumes and forgotten editions. They were old and weathered, and gave his office an incense of musty paper, saged ink and aged leather. A room both pregnant and claustrophobic, and one that left Lydia spellbound. Indeed, she sometimes wondered whether her habit of punching patrons in the face was merely excuse to be summoned to it. Fingleberry wedged himself behind a bunker of books he'd built upon his desk in response to their previous arguments. She followed, besotted by books rather than pending reprimand. He watched her with concern and a sadness for her struggle. Were it not for her blood-stained paw, anyone would assume the most violent thing she contended with each day was getting up at the beginning of it. A dog tall and old, Fingleberry wore glasses that he peered over unless reading, and an old worn coat that he never took off. He had the look of the austere, a drawn searcher and the bearing of a cleric. Being a kindly animal, he'd readily permitted Lydia a position in the library, though hadn't anticipated it being such a violent one. "Lydia," he said.
As we have discussed on previous occasions, there is a limit to how often I can permit this sort of behavior.
She stopped browsing, and her gaze fell to a carpet so old that only mould held it together.
I have tried to help you, he said. I am a very tolerant animal, as you know, and will do anything I can to assist your treatment, but you must understand that I cannot allow such wanton violence upon patrons or staff, including me.
She said nothing, aware she'd broken his nasal septum twice previously.
We all get cross, Lydia. Goodness, we all get frustrated, but you are an intelligent animal, and I cannot understand your predisposition of smashing animals' faces in.
She stared at dusty spines, wondering at the tails that lay within. With a sigh, Fingleberry extricated himself from his bunker. Considering what he was about to say, he felt to deserve a punch in the face.
Lydia, he said, I am very sorry, but although I am head librarian, the great library of Liebe is governed by animals far more influential than me. Your antics have become impossible to hide from their attention, which leaves me in an untenable situation.
She said nothing.
As much as it grieves me, I am on the verge of having to relinquish your terms here.
He braced, expecting a flail of paws, expletives and books. When none arose, he opened an eye. Lydia remained staring at books, while blinking at tears. Although he felt wretched, there was nothing he could say that he hadn't said countless times already. There's a limit to the sacrifice one can make for another before both become embroiled in slaughter. She reached to touch a spine. I understand.
Yes, but you've said that before.
He sighed, aware of the waste. Whether in medicine or in a library, she had much to give, yet was burdened with a mind too insane to deliver. I can hardly blame you, she said. That you have given me opportunity at all leaves me grateful. He looked away, her loneliness more damaging than if she'd lunged at his face.
Lydia, other than your sick notes, I know little of what you have been going through. Perhaps you might help me understand what frustrates you to such an extent. I know you to be far above the mediocrity of others, so why do they infuriate you so?
She sniffed at tears and wiped blood upon shelving. The books had age, wisdom and contentment, while she had nothing.
Do you truly not know? He asked. After all your sessions with Funnel Bremley, do you still not know why you become so angry at others?
I am not angry at others, she whispered, or frustrated with them, despite how it might appear. I am angry and frustrated with myself.
But why, Lydia? You are an intelligent animal, and you've been so committed to getting better. Surely you can find kindness rather than frustration.
A lack of kindness is not the problem, she said. The problem is that I haven't been cured. My madness leaves me so alienated that I'm beyond the help of others. After a sigh, she said, I'm even thinking of trying funnelism. Fingleberry almost choked.
Goodness! Lydia, surely there's no need for that.
Her paw fell from shelving. There's nothing else left.
But surely there must be something.
There is, she said, punching animals in the face. But even that doesn't stop them.
Them?
The hallucinations. I hear things that aren't there, she said, staring at nothing. And see things I shouldn't.
Well, like what?
I hear voices. I see places.
What do you mean?
I see worlds where there should be none and ghosts that walk upon them. Her words shocked him into silence. It happens when I least expect it, she said. It happens out of the blue. It happens when I've forgotten that it happens. That's why it hurts so much. A silence descended that rendered the room small and dense. How cruel is such madness? She cried.
How cruel is it to be assaulted the very moment I've forgotten that I'm haunted?
She turned on the spot.
There is no reprieve. I am forever awake. My insanity not only drives me to despair, but dumps me there. That is why I have little tolerance for others.
She stopped and stared at nothing again.
I am, perhaps, envious of their oblivion.
Fingleberry stared, having been under the impression it had something to do with her mother. After licking his lips, he asked,
What exactly do you see, Lydia? Places unfamiliar, she whispered, despite knowing them. Dark places with shadows where there should be none, and others with colours bereft of hue. Places where mountains touch stars and moon bite soil. Places where animals scream and run, where the earth turns only to see what is chasing it. Worlds unfamiliar, you see, and yet I know of them entirely.
She fell silent, her gaze lingering somewhere beyond them both.
Lydia?
He asked, hesitant to encourage.
They used to whisper, she said. When I was young, I used to wonder whether they were far away. Then they became louder, or closer.
She shook her head, her gaze unbroken.
But now they're too loud to understand. Or what do they say?
When she wiped her eyes and stared at the floor, he retreated to his bunker.
I cannot tell anymore, she said.
Why not?
Because they scream.
He swallowed, noticing how cramped his office was.
And what do they scream about, Lydia? Nightmares.
More swallows and some serious regret about having agreed to funnel Bremley's request.
Have you read all these books?
She asked. He stared, bewildered at her sudden change in demeanour, before realising it might not be unusual when insane of the mind.
Well, yes, he said. Some of them, many times, but not for years now. Ironically, my position here leaves me with little opportunity. Why are they not on the library shelves? Well, most of them are uncatalogued, he said, squeezing from his desk to examine them himself. They're generally rare volumes or overrun editions of forgotten ones.
He reached for a book and pulled it from shelving. Blowing at its dust, he said,
Some have errors that were only discovered after an initial print run and then abandoned once the typeset had been corrected.
He flicked through yellowed pages and felt a warm fondness.
The errors supposedly render them worthless, though I find it makes them priceless.
He offered it to her.
I have collected these over a lifetime and consider them safer here than in my own home.
When she took it, their mutual love of books pushed his concerns aside.
It's a misconception that the worth of a book resides in its words, he continued. There is something far more powerful about a book than what's held within its text.
He glanced at her.
Do you know what that might be, Lydia? Do you know to what I refer?
She turned the book in her paws. Its leather jacket was clean from being tucked against another, and its gilded lettering remained bright despite dusty spine. With pages yellowed where they'd been exposed to air, they remained a crisp, textured cream within. She brought the book up to her nose and breathed its scent. Fingleberry smiled.
That's right, he said. Books are not for eyes alone. Their words may be printed, but books are for all the senses. Their aroma tells tales too, as does the feel of their press, and their binding, and their weight within paw, even the sound of page against page, and the texture of grain and leather, even the very bumps of their gild. And taste? She asked. He raised his whiskers, impressed. It is certainly true that book connoisseurs will always buy 2 copies, one to read and one to eat. Books are to be digested, Lydia, literally. Terribly good for the bowels, you see. Is that really true? Oh, yes. They are almost entirely roughage. No, I mean about connoisseurs always buying 2. He nodded. She looked again at the one in her paws before saying, "During the stillest part of the night, when I'm too frightened to sleep, I feel more might be hidden between their lines than contained within them. It's not the words that are important, but what the mind constructs in between them." He felt a stab of despair at her madness. It was a cruel irony that her intuition for books resulted in expulsion from them. "Are there more of these?" she asked. He frowned. "You do realize what I've said, Lydia, that from this moment on, I am bordering on relinquishing your employment here." She nodded and glanced around, convinced the world's most hallowed library must harbour rooms full of the things. "Yes, but you said as much alongside the word bordering, which suggests some hope remains." "I can give you one more chance, Lydia, one more only. The next hint of unprovoked public rhinoplasty, and you will leave me no choice but to terminate your employment here. Do you understand?" She nodded. "I understand, yes." Understanding was one thing, but ensuring as much was another. "So what will you do?" he asked. "How will you make certain such behaviour doesn't occur again? I do not want to banish you from this place. I know how much it means to you, but you must understand there is little more I can do if things continue to regress. It really is up to you." She glared. "It has always been up to me," she said. "Always. No other creature has been able to help. Regardless of qualification, it's been more lonely than you can possibly imagine." When she held out the book, he took it. Her resilience was remarkable. She had the courage of an animal who'd only ever battled alone. He deliberated over something he should not, wondering whether there was a final bastion in which she might find answers to her plight. He put the book upon others covering his desk. "Come with me." He took a large ring of keys from a drawer and led her from his office. In a corridor, not much wider, he unlocked a door that led deeper into the library's bowels. He trudged down an old wooden staircase, while Lydia followed. Dim lamps glowed on wood-panelled wall, the latter sagging with age, which pushed at floorboards no less decrepit. It became dark where bulbs had not been replaced, and air held a staleness suggesting few ventured down often enough to warrant doing so. They passed doors bowed and wedged, their fragile frames distorted by weight of building that bore upon them. When Fingleberry stopped at one of them, he hesitated. Keys jangled when he turned to her. "Few animals come down here," he whispered, the words loud enough in such confines. "Certainly not without knowing what lies at such depths." He looked at the door and deliberated further. "You should not be shown this place, Lydia. It exists for those of a certain education only, a certain echelon. That said, I cannot offer anything else that might help you find an answer to your predicament. Were it not for your intuition of books, I would not dare. But we are here now, and I shall take the risk of revealing something that remains unknown to almost all." He looked at her sternly. "Your plight has me certain you can honour secrets, Lydia, and I beg that for my sake you do not tell a soul what you see, let alone that you know of it. Is that agreed?" She nodded. He jangled keys in a lock and pushed at a door. There was a squeak before air thick with mustiness, dust and age spilled from it. He stepped into a vast hall and brushed cobwebs from an old switch. Flicking it on, lone bulbs buzzed into life at its heights, illuminating countless rows of loaded bookshelves. Their mass soared to more than 3 stories and were so old that they teetered in warp, while their pinnacles were dark and grey with dust and web. Lydia followed in astonishment, staring at heights and turning on the spot to aid comprehension. Despite the number of books, she could find no words. Fingleberry offered some. "This is a secret vault beneath the great library of Lieb," he said, "and is known to only a select few elders of influence. It contains volumes lost to the world, editions dangerous and forbidden, books that should never have been written, Herein lie texts that even I do not dare peruse."
They stared for a time, he with reverence and she with bewilderment.
"My duty is to shelve them and nothing more," he continued. "I know well what damage holding flame might do to my pores."
Lydia peered between rows, unable to conceive such a secret. Fingleberry followed, pondering the same.
"It is a peculiar thing," he admitted, "that libraries across the world wish to compare themselves with the great library of Liebe without knowing what treasure it truly houses. But there must be thousands here. Several thousand, in fact. But why here?"
she asked, hurrying to a shelf and wiping caked dust from spines.
"Why are these hidden? Why are they not on the shelves upstairs?" "Lydia, you make the mistake of assuming that just because a book is written, it should be read."
She turned to him, puzzled. He took a deep breath.
"Upon these shelves are texts, ideas and imaginings considered dangerous in the paws of ordinary animals."
Her puzzlement became a glower. "Who are you to decide what should or should not be read?"
"I decide nothing, Lydia. I am merely the head librarian. Such decisions are made by animals in far loftier realms than mine."
"And what gives them the right?"
He shrugged. "It is not my place to question, but certainly they have their reasons. Who knows? Perhaps they wrote them."
She turned back to the books.
"Wrote them? But some of these must be hundreds of years old.
There's no way their authors could still be alive."
"Not the authors themselves, Lydia, but the schools founded upon them."
She turned to glower again.
"The world is old, Lydia, very old. We can conceive it only on the scale of our own lives, but thousands have lived before you and me. Thousands who read and thought and wrote with a conviction then as strong as yours and mine is now."
She humphed. "My conviction borders on being remarkably fragile, actually." Fingleberry conceded this with a nod. "If these are so dangerous," she asked, "why are you revealing them to me?"
"Because although these books are deemed perilous, I must confess to finding you far more so."
She thought about this before shrugging in acceptance.
"But I also wonder whether you might find within these volumes some clue as to why you are the way you are. Perhaps some means to help yourself. Because for all you have read in the library above, I fear you are no better mended than upon your arrival."
Turning back to shelves, she wondered at the possibility herself. After all, it was unlikely they'd mention her mother. There was a sudden flash, followed by a high-pitched whine. She wasn't expecting either, which was always the way, and she took a step backwards as realization dawned. "No," she growled, unable to believe it was happening. "No, not now, not here." She grabbed her head, furious that when shown something so wonderful she was brutally reminded of why it was revealed at all. Above her, bookshelves began to warp. Another step backwards. "No!" she cried, paws over ears as shelving reached across aisle. "Not now! Please, not now!" As shelves stretched, books began to melt and slide downwards, the hall's height elongated before disappearing in silent tear to reveal a night sky beyond. Bulbs, buzzing in low wattage, exploded, their glass shattering across sky in a shower of scattered stars. Around her, floorboard bent and rolled, flexing as though pushed from beneath. With a pop, they sprang upwards and began sawing each other, leaving her to scream and stumble amongst their splinters. A rumble shuddered as shelving twisted to revert back to the branch and bark they came from, which then blistered to reveal rock like bone beneath flesh. From it sprang grass and vine, and torn pages melted into its grain, while covers scurried into crevices like rats. In despair, she lunged for the doorway, only to see it race away to the horizon and grow into a moon, before floating upwards like a bubble, with Fingleberry's horrified face staring from it. Her frantic breaths became sobs of terror, and she sank to a floor that had become wet and pungent soil. A storm of leaves began to rain. They were cold and heavy and threatened to bury. She scrambled through them, desperate to escape along a path that appeared, until it disappeared beneath leaves also. She fell sideways when ground heaved, cracked, and fell to an abyss. Night became bathed in pale moonlight and swirled where mist rose. Choking on cries, she grabbed at vine and pulled herself against cold stone, fighting through fern and frond until finding a crag. She crammed into it as leaves threatened to overwhelm. She covered her ears, knowing the screams would soon begin, and began singing in a futile attempt at drowning their cries. She sung between sobs, a song about a cradle. "Hush, now and sleep! I am here! Close those tired eyes!" When screams arrived, they were like metal striking bone. They stung and split and emptied her of marrow. Having stumbled back to the doorway, Fingleberry watched in despair as Lydia cowered halfway up a bookshelf. With paws over her ears and eyes screwed shut, she sung in a wail of sob. Not knowing what to do, he stared until realizing one thing clearly, that showing her this vault was a biblical mistake. He wanted to run and hide, but her behavior was so disturbing that he couldn't move. She clutched and sung and wept a lullaby he knew well, one his mother had often sung to him. Thank you for listening to When Fear Is Not Afraid, the fourth Velvet Paw of Asquith novel by Thomas Caulfield. Editing by Stephanie Mills, music by JCMP, engineering by Michael Teo and produced by Andrew Cameron. Visit velvetpawofasquith.com to learn more about the books and thomascaulfield.com to insult him about them.